Okay, in this tutorial, I'm going to explore a range of techniques you can use to present land use data that you may have gathered. Now, in this case, we're talking about urban land use data. So urban land use data tends to refer to what the buildings are being used for across an urban landscape. And that could be the entire urban landscape, or it could be an area of an urban landscape. The first thing you need to do when gathering land use data is you actually need to get hold of what we call a base map. Okay, and here you can see a simple base map of an area of a town. Okay, now one thing that tends to be available from planning departments or from the Ordnance Survey are these very detailed kind of building outline maps. The one thing that's not available is actually what the buildings are being used for. And of course, that does change quite regularly as people come in and out of buildings. Generally speaking, though, the actual land use, whether it's retail or commerce or residential, doesn't actually change. A shop doesn't turn into a house and then turn into a factory. Not in the United Kingdom, certainly. The next thing to do is you then have to actually find out what are the land uses across the landscape. Now, once again, the local authorities tend to have a good record of that, and it's reasonably up to date because most land uses are recorded in the land registry office in any local authority, in any town council. But if you were to do this yourself, you would use what's called the Ricebot system. And the Ricebot system is a straightforward system that you'll have probably already had mentioned to you. Each of these letters represent one of the land uses. So R is residential, I is industry, C is commerce, E is entertainment, P is public buildings like schools and churches and anything that the public might use, O is offices, T is transport, and S is, if I can remember correctly, services. Anyway, that is the simple system. And when you see a building, you would go walk around the town and you'd write the letter on the building to represent what it was. So that's the data gathering. And it's an appropriate technique because you actually have to visit the place, and it's when you're there, it means you're getting live data. It's going to be accurate for that moment in time. It can often be one of the problems, I suppose, is that buildings can be 2 or 3 floors, and the land use on the ground floor might not be the same as the land use on the 2nd or 3rd floor. So often a shop, for example, on the ground floor might have offices on the 2nd, 3rd floor. Maybe the 4th floor might be residential. So that's one of the drawbacks of the system. But generally speaking, it's going to be inaccurate because it's systematic, because you have to go and actually find every building and what it's being used for. How do you present it? What could you use? Well, the first one would be a simple GOAD plan. Okay, so this is a very basic data presentation. It's rather crude, but what we can see is we have written the land use of every building. So we can see who's in it. Now, it doesn't actually really tell us what they're doing, but it does tell us, for example, if it was shops, what all the different businesses are. Now, you often will see these maps as you enter town centres. So when people are visiting places, they can actually find out where the different shops are across a town centre. If they go into a shopping mall, you'll see a very similar type of thing. So there's a reason you might choose to have a GOAD plan, especially if it's being used by members of the public to find out what is where in a town. It doesn't really help you find out patterns of land use, though. So that's where you need some more elaborate techniques. So the second technique would be where you gather the main land use in an area and you put it all for that one color. So we can see in this area here, most of the land uses in this zone are retail. Now, they might not all be retail, but the majority is retail, so we've colored this area red. The majority of this area here are transit stations with mixed use. The majority of the areas here are residentials, okay? And it allows us to start to see a pattern. So the reason for creating a land use, urban zone map like this would be just to see a general pattern across an urban space, helping us identify the different land use zones. Another aspect of this data presentation is that color is the key to help us easily identify different land uses, which makes it quite easy to interpret as well. All right, let's look at another one. This is very similar to the previous one. This one now, rather than looking at whole zones, this actually breaks down the building by building land use and can allow us to see very clearly which land uses are dominating. So I can see that yellow dominates certainly in this area over here, and that's retail. I can see we've got quite a bit of commercial land use in this zone. And down here, we've got some educational land uses in this area here. Okay, so just like the previous map, this one allows us to see patterns and variations, but just on a more detailed level because we're now looking at each and every building. It might be appropriate, for example, to use this if you're just looking at a specific area of a city to see how much variation there is in land uses. Okay, this technique is a little bit different. This is using a different type of land use here. Instead of looking at buildings, we're looking at other land uses. So for example, we're looking at trees, lights, benches, bins, and where they're located across an urban landscape. And these obviously are land uses and therefore relevant. And we're using dots and different color dots to present that data. And what this does quite nicely is it allows you to spot clustering. So we can see a cluster of trees in this particular zone. We can see clusters of lights around the junctions. We can see benches clustered in certain areas, but not in other areas. So obviously when we can see clusters of things happening in some areas and absences of those things in other areas, it allows us to identify, do we need to implement some changes? Do we need to put some benches in this area, for example, because there are no benches? If we look at bins, are there areas where there's a lack of bins? Well, I can see there's very few bins in this zone. There's very few bins in this zone. So this technique using dot maps allows us to identify patterns, and therefore, more specifically, if there's an absence of something, we can then address that if we were maybe managing that. Right, this technique, you've come across this before. This is geolocated pie charts. So if we can't actually physically visit an entire urban area, we just visit some spots in an area and then count the amount of each of the different land uses found in that area. We can then turn that raw count into a pie chart. And as long as this is a color-coded pie chart, we can see, for example, that over 3/4 of the land use in this area is residential. And it's really visual to see. Pie charts are really quick to interpret. We can see that in this zone, more than 75% was retail. And over here, 1/3 of our land use, the most dominant land use, was commercial. Okay. And there might be reasons to be able to see that I'm comparing the different land uses of different areas. And color is a key here. And I'm linking my pie charts with my actual map. So that it's not just a pie chart for area 3, but I actually now know where area 3 is. And the map might give me additional information that might help me understand what I'm seeing in the pie chart, which is another advantage of geolocating. Okay, so what we've done today is explore a range of different techniques that you can use to present land use data, along with the strengths of those different techniques. So those would be the reasons to use the technique.